Joining me now, Andrij Dobriansky of the Ukrainian Congress Committee of America to talk more about Zelensky's visit to Washington and the critical nature of these discussions. As always, welcome. There was an article in the New York Times this morning that caught my attention, suggesting that Ukraine is at the most perilous point since this war began, in desperate need for U.S. support. Is there a lot of truth to that, and at this critical time and juncture where Ukraine is?
Well, it's definitely not a time where you want to have your biggest partner pull out. And that's really why President Zelenskyy is here. He's here because if the United States doesn't pass this now, and it's more than likely, as you're reading in that article in the Times and a bunch of others, that the senators will need more time, even with many senators willing to stay through Christmas. It just takes a while to change U.S. asylum policy. It's not something you can negotiate overnight. But what kind of president would he be if he didn't come here to the United States while he has people manning the front lines in the middle of winter, sitting in trenches covered in snow? This is an obligation for a leader. And no matter what the situation is going forward for the next couple of months, and we are very worried about a hardened ground allowing tanks to roll over it that they couldn't do in the mud. So actually, winter is a very dangerous time for invasion. This is what he needs to be doing, because if the United States doesn't pass this now, we really worry about how can they pass something during an election season when tempers and rhetoric just get elevated.
Right, and it becomes less of a priority. And to your point on winter, Russia weaponized winter in the past. They'll do it again. But let's look at some of these numbers, Andre. By mid-November, the U.S. Defense Department had used 97% of the $62.3 billion in supplemental funding it had received for Ukraine, and the State Department had used all of the $4.7 billion in military assistance funding it had been allocated to help Ukraine. So the question being, how do you respond to those who say Ukraine's ask is unrealistic? Look how much the U.S. has already given. It needs to fight on a tighter budget.
Right, except that we do know from the United States' own admission that 90% of that money is remaining in the United States. This is money that goes to pay people's jobs, working class jobs, skilled jobs, metal workers who put together artillery shells, people who are invested in working for the United States defense industry across many, many states. And so when we're talking about these negotiations, the thing for everybody to realize is what's being talked about are accounting measures. We're talking about how do we quantify and allocate value to things that the United States already has. For the most part, what we are giving Ukraine are things that are existing in warehouses. That happened with the dual-use munitions, what people call cluster bombs. That happened with the ATACMS. We finally gave them 150-kilometer weapons. But unfortunately, they are so old, they wouldn't even be used by the United States. These are so what we're giving Ukraine are things, and what the argument in Congress and what legislators do are trying to figure out how do we account for them in our accounting budgets. For me, it's really kind of laughable when people talk about value of things, because Ukrainians, for the most part, don't receive foreign money. They've never had pallets of cash, the likes of which we saw the stories in Iraq and Afghanistan. This is about material support, the kind that we did during World War II, the kind we've always done as a nation with our allies, and the kind we want to do for Israel as well. So accounting be damned, Ukraine is going to get its support. We'll just see where it's going to come from.
Right. And I understand when you're talking about the logistics of it, some of the accounting of it, but there's also the strategy of it. Might it be an easier sell if there's a new approach to the strategy? Because there's been criticism that the counteroffensive failed and that there is a stalemate right now. There was success from Ukraine in Crimea. Might we see an approach similar to that moving forward? Would that be easier to convince?
I would say that the fact that there is no existing Russian Navy operating in the Black Sea is probably a pretty good victory for a country without a Navy. The fact that all of Ukraine's central river, the Dnipro, the fact that Ukraine has crossed it at all points to the other side, which is a phenomenal feat, but it's very, very tiny on a map if you zoom out and try to see who's crossed the river. But the entire left bank is now being controlled by Ukraine. There are enormous victories. It's just that people don't understand how long this can happen. We're not even at a third of what a long offensive would have been during World War II, during Korea or other long conflicts. And this is all being borne by the Ukrainian people. So for people in the United States to talk about fatigue when, again, we have people sitting in trenches covered in snow, They're getting their heat from a cigarette just like a USGI would have 80 years ago. Let's do the right thing by them and give them physical things that are, again, sitting in our warehouses. We're not sending them any cash. Our people in the United States are getting good paying jobs because of this funding. And let's make sure that we settle this now. That's why Zelenskyy is here and what he talked about at the Defense University. Finish it now. Otherwise, this is just going to keep coming back year after year from Russia.
Right. And maybe worse than that, I'm not looking to scare people, and I don't think that's the right tactic, but there is certain value in fear. And as President Biden says, if inability here, Putin gains strength in his position. If the U.S. does not support Ukraine, Putin wins. It's the what's next factor, right, that needs to be argued?
100%. That's why people try to scaremonger regarding, U.S. boots on the ground. U.S. boots are on the ground in NATO countries, which is where they should be. What nobody wants to see is any of those countries be crossed over into with tanks, just like what's happening in Ukraine, like what happened in Georgia, like what happened in Moldova and Azerbaijan. They have troops all over the place, including Syria. What we want to see is that we localize this to Ukraine, that we stop what Russia has been doing decade after decade, and eventually we have a much better system going forward. Because if we allow this to happen, like you said, it's the fear of what's to come, and we do not want American GIs to be on the front line. Let it be Ukraine's GIs. They're the ones who are willing to fight, as well as international volunteers. But let them be the fighters. All we have to do is literally give the United States people jobs so that they can send weapons to Ukraine. It's not a big ask.
Well, we'll see if the order is too tall today as President Zelenskyy meets with President Biden and congressional leaders. Andrij Dobriansky, as always, appreciate your perspective. Thank you.
Thank you.
Another part of Ukraine.